Welcome everyone to this webinar from Women Mobilize Women's Side, and we're really excited to be here, and I'm going to hand over straight to our host, Melissa Bruntlett.
Thanks, Julia. I'm really pleased to be here to welcome everybody to this first in a series of webinars on intersectionality of gender and mobility. We're really excited about this first episode, which features Veronica Davis and Tamika Butler from America, bringing their perspectives as African-American individuals that can give some insights into their experiences and what we need to be considering in terms of the intersectionality of mobility and race. As Julia said, if you have any questions throughout the viewing, feel free to throw them in the chat. We will have a little bit of a Q&A afterwards. We do have Veronica here, and I'm not sure if Tamika has joined us. They are on the West Coast of North America, so it might be a bit trickier. But if so, at the end, you can ask them questions directly, and I hope you enjoy. So whenever you're ready, let's get it started.
We don't have the audio yet.
Okay. Let me try one more time.
Okay, there's lots of more people coming in right now. This looks good.
Everyone to this Women Mobilize Women webinar on the intersectionality of gender and mobility. The intersection of identities and experiences produces a really different perspective of mobility for a lot of different people. And so as a result, a gender-sensitive mobility transition is about more than one's identified gender. It's impacted also by one's age, ability, economic access, and geographic location, amongst other things. So in this webinar series, we'll dive into those topics surrounding intersectionality of gender and mobility over a series of 30-minute episodes. My name is Melissa Bruntlett, and I'm an inclusive mobility advocate and Women Mobilize Women ambassador. And in this episode, we will discuss gender, mobility, and racial identity in the American diaspora. Gender and mobility are not binary experiences, and so this webinar is going to focus on how beyond gender, racial identity impacts one experience of mobility, from issues such as increased fear and experiences of violence, persecution, and exclusion, to considerations around cost, access, comfort, reporting of incidents, and so on. And so just to discuss that more in depth, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Tamika Butler, founder of and principal at Tamika O Butler Consulting, and Veronica O Davis, a self-described transportation nerd and author of the book Inclusive Transportation, a Manifesto for Repairing Divided Communities. You can read their full bios in the episode description, but without further ado, Tamika and Veronica, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's jump right in with my first question. What would each of you say are some of the ways that gender, mobility, and race intersect in your experiences? And I'll start with you, Veronica, and then let's just have a discussion.
Absolutely. So hello, everyone. Thank you to all of the listeners. I'll say that it all shows up in different ways. So one being a woman navigating space. You know, there was a question that was posed on social media maybe 5-6 years ago, and someone said, at what age did you know you were a woman? And most of the comments, you know, people talk about being 12 or 13, and that's their first time being in public space and being publicly catcalled by men. And so when you think about how women navigate space, you know, how many of us have walked by a group of men, and it doesn't matter what race, what age, but we do the pretend like we're on the phone or walk quickly. And it's just, you don't want to be bothered. You just want to move through this space safely. And every woman has a story of being on guard in these type of settings. And so that's what it looks like. And I'm not even talking about at night when the boogeyman is out. I'm talking like even in broad daylight, this sense of safety and comfort. We do know, even just based on research, women are more likely to dictate the transportation choices of the family. They are likely, not in all families, but they are likely the ones getting the kids to and from school, daycare, soccer, and all of this. So women are constantly moving through a space, in order to facilitate the needs of the family. And that is, there's men that are stepping it up, but largely in this country, it is the women who are making those choices. And then when you bring Blackness into the fold, as we look at the U.S. history, we're recording this during Black History Month, but as we look at U.S. history, we know that Black people existing in public spaces was not always a safe thing, regardless of whether you identify as a man, a woman, gender nonconforming, or any of those things. We know that it wasn't safe for us to exist in space. It wasn't safe for us to be in public transportation. And as we even celebrate the birthday of Rosa Parks and her defiance of moving, even before her, you had Elizabeth Jennings in New York in the 1800s who just wanted to ride on a streetcar and was told that she couldn't. And so just being Black in space, is always a challenge. You just never know how you are perceived. And then while I have the benefit of being more feminine presenting, there is a level of consciousness that I do have. And I know this was especially after the death of Trayvon Martin, the murder of Trayvon Martin, was being conscious of like not wearing a hoodie, because what if I wear a hoodie and someone assumes that I'm a little Black kid, and now I am perceived differently and I'm perceived as a threat. And so as these things of all these pieces are constantly flowing as you're making decisions and as you're moving.
Of course, yeah. And Tamika, how would you sort of add to that?
Yeah, I mean, Veronica really hit all the things, right? I am not someone who is as feminine presenting, and there have still been times when I'm walking down the street and dudes will be like, "Where you going? Where are you going? Let me walk with you. Let me walk with you." And she's right. You speed up a little bit, and I do think that this is something that we're conscious of all the time as women. But to Veronica's point, you layer Blackness on top of it. And one of my great mentors and hero is an urbanist city maker superstar out of Canada, Jay Pitter. And something she said is that for Black folks, our introduction to the Western world was in the public square, right? From the minute we were on the auction block, we were keenly aware of how we are perceived in public, what we must do in public, speak, don't speak, look down, look away, and in that public sphere, it is always dangerous. And so I think when you have that history as a Black person in the Western world, and then again, we're talking about the layers, right? Something that's been going around online is that a lot of countries have safety nets. The United States has women. Like that is our safety net. And so when you're constantly carrying those two things at the same time, there's no other way of being. So it's not that you don't think about it because it's become just part of who you are. It's that you're always thinking about it. You're always consciously aware of it. And you're always thinking about, how do I make myself such that other people won't fear me, right? When people feel that Blackness is a weapon, or Blackness equates to danger, and at the same time, being a woman equates to weakness or availability, you have to be thinking about those things. And the last thing I'll say is Veronica's absolutely right, is we've seen the continued public lynchings of Black folks in the United States. But frankly, anti-Blackness is universal. I have traveled the world, and everywhere I have traveled, from the Netherlands to Spain, to Asia, where I grew up, my Blackness didn't stop. And so I think that for me in particular, sometimes people see me and they see a young Black man. And so I have this unique, is it a privilege or is it a curse? I don't know, of understanding what it means to move through space, both as a Black woman and I think for at times as a Black man. And I understand as a parent of two Black children, a little Black girl and a little Black boy, that every time I go into the public sphere and am my authentic self and full of joy and pride and taking up space, there's a risk I might not come home, whether or not I'm walking around my neighborhood with a hoodie, eating Skittles, or shopping at my grocery store, right? And there's a reason Black moms are constantly like, where are you going? Call me when you get there. Call me when you get back. Because there is that risk at all times.
And that doesn't go away. I am at my big age. My mother still is texting me, did you make it home?
Yeah, don't let them see on social media or something that you had a speaking engagement or that you were somewhere and you didn't tell them. So yeah, and it's what we've been taught, that there other people fear us, no matter who we are, no matter how successful we are, no matter how many degrees we get, what kind of car we drive, what kind of clothes we wear. People will view us as a threat.
Mm-hmm. And so building on that, obviously just being in space and having to think about what it's like to be in space as a Black woman has an impact, or gender nonconforming. But in terms of transport choices, how does that influence how what choices you can make for those that have the privilege to make the choice, or those that don't? And what kind of barriers does that place for transportation for Black women, Indigenous women, and people of color?
I think that for this one, you have to kind of separate the groups a little bit more. So one of the things I will say, when I used to live in DC, and so they made public transportation free for children because there was no busing system. So you use public transportation to get to school. But no one took into account that the mother has to take this kid to school. And so there is still a cost of transportation for this mother to get her child to and from school. And there's a difference between a neighborhood school where the bus, where it's just a bus ride versus taking the train across the city, which you are talking about a significant amount of money and time, right, to get across town. So I think that that's a conversation that it becomes a class, which I think it is important to bring that component into it, because that does affect the decisions of certain class, of the decisions may be limited, because it is expensive to own a vehicle. Even used vehicles today, the car note is well over $400, $500 a month, maintenance and all of those things. So it is very expensive to own a vehicle. And so that affects choice, and that affects a lot of impact on that particular family. I think that for some of us with higher incomes, there is a privilege to have choice. There is the privilege to be able to drive and park at work or do all these things. So I think the choice is, there is a gender aspect to it of, for me, when I was commuting to work, I drove because the bus was just short of the daycare. And one thing I'm not about to do in the morning is try to wrestle a toddler 4 city blocks to daycare in the morning when we could barely get out the house. And so for me, that affects my decision, where I would actually prefer to take the bus. I now have to drive because of the choices I've made for where my child goes to the daycare. So I think it's all of those things. And I think as women, we are the, there's a term they call it, of like, we bury the mental load of all these decisions that we have to make, where our kids go to school, where our kids go to daycare, where our kids do all these things, and then the transportation decision that wraps around all of those things.
Yeah, I'll say I have a few friends who just had babies, who are also in queer relationships, and we always sit around and talk about how, and it was the same when my wife had our kids in her mom group, that the division of labor conversation is just different for us with two moms, right? And part of why it's different is because society has taught us and has conditioned us that it is the woman's role. So we have two people in our relationship who are like, I have to figure this out. And so in some ways, we're both engaged. But I also think that Veronica is absolutely right. You know, I came to urban planning from a long path. I went to law school and I was a civil rights lawyer. And I didn't love being a lawyer. And I got a job by chance at the LA County Bicycle Coalition because I love riding my bike. And that's how I got into the transportation space. And so my background in transportation is really all about active transportation, biking, walking, you know, taking the bus. Like that's who I am as a person. And I remember, you know, having my first kid, and I was working at a private consulting firm, Tool Design, that does incredible work. Again, biking, walking, and transit. Like that is the focus of that firm. And so I was working there, and I remember getting the job and talking to HR and being like, so what's my, like, are you guys paying for parking? And they're like, nah, you know, we pay for transit passes. You know, we can pay for like a tune-up at a bike shop. You know, we can pay for these certain things. And that's not shade against Tool. Like I loved my time at Tool. I learned so much from another, you know, mentor visionary, Jennifer Toole. But as I started to think about it, all of the different firms I was applying at and all of the different places that I was applying at where I was aligned with the work they were doing based on who I was as a person, because they were about getting people out of cars, I still needed a car, right? I live in Los Angeles and I have 2 kids. And so to Veronica's point, I'm privileged. I have the choice, right? Like I have a car. I can make that decision. But I think sometimes we like to, those of us who are in active transportation, we like to, you know, demonize. Is it bikes versus cars? Is it transit versus cars? And, you know, now I am still consulting, but I'm also a PhD student at the University of California, Los Angeles, and I'm working with their Institute for Transportation Studies and the Lewis Center. And we're doing this interesting work here in Los Angeles. We have a universal basic mobility pilot where we're giving people $150 a month. And by we, I mean LA Department of Transportation and LA Metro, kind of our regional transit agency. And I'm on a team of folks along with UC Davis who are figuring out how are people using this money. And something that my brilliant supervisors, Maddie Brosen and Evie Blumenberg, are really interested in is, in particular, what's the difference for women, right? And when you look at the research, how could you help low-income women? Give them cars, right? And so we have to understand that we live in a world where, yes, like as people, Veronica and I love our bikes, we love transit, but until we have built the world through infrastructure and through investments where people can use those things, we have to realize the reality that we're in, and that for many folks, especially in our country, low-income folks of color who have been planned against, who have been isolated and segregated into these communities without services, we have to acknowledge that there is a world where a car is more helpful. And then the last thing I'll say, because you know we're only talking for 30 minutes and we've only had 2 questions, and Veronica and I are just going, is Veronica's right. Like people of color, low-income people of color, are outside of the United States, racialized people, we disproportionately suffer. But when you disaggregate that, it's really Black folks and Indigenous folks who lack the infrastructure the most, need it the most, and frankly are getting killed the most in these streets from just getting hit. And so we have to really be conscious of both the world we live in and the world we want. We do this work because we're hopeful and we see that other world, but we can't demonize people as we're getting to that world. We have to help them exist in the world that currently is here.
And I want to follow up on this point because
Yeah,
someone,
go ahead.
I was talking with a doctor yesterday and we were talking about infrastructure and public health and children. And one of the things that he shared with me was a story of a little girl. She was type 1 diabetic. And I don't know the medical term that he used, but it basically, she didn't have the insulin she needed and was like in whatever the state that it's called, not a doctor. Um, and so it was very easy to just say, oh, well, they couldn't afford the insulin. And it's like, no, she could. Medicare covered the insulin. The issue was the person, her caregiver, was wheelchair bound and couldn't make the quarter of a mile trip to the pharmacy because of the lack of sidewalks. And that is why this little girl did not have her insulin. And so I think going back to the bigger picture, it's very, we as across industries have to be able to tackle our biases against the different communities, because it's very easy to look at this little Black girl and say, oh, well, her parents neglected her and that's why she's here in this critical condition. No, that's not what happened. It's the lack of infrastructure, which we know is in Black and brown communities across every city that you look in. When you look at where there's no sidewalks, broken sidewalks, it is in Black and brown communities. And so we have to think differently. And even as we talk about education, it's being able to have quality neighborhood education. And we know that there are, in the US anyway, it seems like there's a systematic desire to dismantle the public education system. And so then now you have people, mothers that are like, hey, I'm trying to fight, but also I want to make sure my child has the best education that I'm able to give. And so now it means I have to commute across the city, across the community in order to facilitate that. And so I think it's all of these things together.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. That, I mean, all of what you've both spoken about is really comes down to this idea that it's not, when we're talking about transport or mobility, it's not just about mobility. It's about all the externalities of lack of access that can produce, or too much access for some group can disadvantage others. And yeah, no, I think, Tamika, you're absolutely right. I think in active mobility, we focus so much on cars are bad and everything else is good. But for those people that don't have a choice, if they're working shift work and our transport networks don't provide for them, or lack of sidewalks, like you said, Veronica, that car is their mobility tool. And we have to still keep that in mind and not make people feel bad because they have no other choice. But that sort of makes me think, and I'm going to combine the last two questions kind of in terms of this, what we're missing or overlooking in planning and design practices, and what kind of reactive or proactive approaches we can take that harken to what you talk about in Veronica, this empathetic approach to our cities. What are we missing, or what can we be doing better that the audience watching or people that come to this later can learn from to take into their practice, not just in America, but throughout the world? Because I think these ideas are really quite universal in terms of how they can be applied. Tamika, why don't you go first? Go ahead, Veronica, sorry.
I was going to pick up with something that Tamika started off with in her opening statement, and talking about it's really not just an American challenge, where race shows up different in America, but it doesn't lessen it in other places. And specifically, we had an experience together in Salzburg, Austria. And the long and short was, it was a group of people from all across the world to really tackle public health and the built infrastructure and bringing all these people together. But one of the central challenges, particularly for the people from the European countries, is it was a value judgment of like, oh, we don't have racial problems like you all have in America. Everything is fine here. We're all white. We're all this. And I think what's important for everybody is you have to understand there is always an other. Even in the most homogeneous society, there are still the others. And it's very easy, especially when you're from the dominant culture, to assume everyone's experience is your experience. And so that's where it is important as practitioners to take the time to get to know the different types of people that you are serving and listening to what they are saying. And it becomes very critical because, there was a person there from the Netherlands, and they were like, nah, we don't have these problems. And we're like, Black Pete said, what? But even beyond that, think about all of the immigrant communities that have moved into some of these countries. Would they say the same thing? Is that their shared experience? And even as you see on social media, which now allows us to connect and communicate across the globe, there is like Black expats that are talking about, hey, this is my experience living in Poland. No, this is my experience living in London. So it is very important to make sure, especially when you're from the dominant culture, to not assume that everyone's experience is your experience.
And I'll say three quick things. First, I think, part of what I'm doing in my PhD is centering Blackness. Like, that's what my research is about. And I'm also trying to bring in Indigenous ways of being and thinking, because I think too often, in whether it's environmental work or built environment or transportation work, there are folks whose land we have taken, whose stolen land we are on. And you know what? They had solutions. They have solutions, and they have been caretakers of this land. And I think it's really elevating those voices and listening to them. The second thing I'll say is learn about universal basic mobility. Our study is not done, so I can't go into it, but the stories we're hearing and the ways in which just having, the resources to have options, to be able to not worry about, am I going to be able to make bus fare? Am I going to be able to do this? The things we're hearing about how having that bit of money to not have to factor in really allows you to think about your mobility differently. And to Veronica's point, get to board job interviews, be on time to work, get to doctor's appointments. So learn about universal basic mobility. I think the potential is huge. And then, the last thing I'll say is, in this thing we did in Salzburg together, we came up with a framework for really thinking about power and privilege, because too often people want to talk about equity or DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they don't want to talk about power, and they don't want to talk about privilege. And so the way we broke it down is, first you have to create a space where you normalize talking about these things, where you realize that you might get it wrong, you might say the right thing, but you just got to get right back up on that bike and keep going, right? You have to try to normalize these conversations. And that's not a safe space. That's a brave space where you are brave enough to get it wrong and keep going. And then second, when you're thinking about a policy decision or infrastructure or whatever, think about who's most likely to be impacted by it. That's not just benefited. It could be negatively impacted or positively impacted. Who's most likely to be impacted? And then look around at that decision-making table. Are they there? And too often in spaces, the answer is no. And if the answer is no, you have to ask yourself, then what was needed power-wise or privilege-wise to be at this space? Did they have to be able to traverse the sidewalks? Did they have to be able to speak this language? Did they have to be able to come to a meeting in the middle of the day? And so, that's a three-step easy way to really confront power and privilege in all that you do. And just listen to the people who are most impacted.
Those are excellent points. And thank you, Veronica. I see you shared that, and we'll share that in the show notes, the link to what you're talking about there. I love that idea of universal basic mobility. I hear a lot about universal access design, but this idea of just what's the basic that somebody needs to do what they need to do in their daily lives, and then how can we at least fill that gap before thinking about, how do we provide all of the other options for people? And certainly, I'm going to read that. I need to. In this work, I know it's my job to recognize my own privilege and find that space. But I appreciate everything that you two have discussed, and the ideas and thoughts that you provided, because I think it really, for me, I always learn. I love these things because I get to learn from wonderful experts like yourselves and broaden my own knowledge, but get to share that with as many people as possible. So thank you so much for sharing your stories and your truths. And I hope that for those that want to keep the conversation going, they reach out to you. How can they find you if someone wants to carry on a conversation with you?
Well, on X, formerly known as Twitter, I am at Veronica O Davis, and then my personal website is veronicao.com.
And similarly, X, formerly known as Twitter, for anybody who's still there. I'm at Tamika Butler, TAMIKABUTLER, and my personal website is tamikabutler.com. I also love Instagram, Tamika L. Butler. So yeah, hit us up. We always respond. It might take a minute, but we always respond.
Well, once again, thank you so much, both of you. I really appreciate it. For those that have been following along, we do have, this is part of a series of webinars on intersectionality, so please check the other ones out. And otherwise, thank you again, and we'll see you next time. All right.
Thank you.
I will stop. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to stop recording very quickly. Welcome back, everyone. Like Julia said, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. And Veronica, if you want to put your camera and microphone on to join us, you're more than welcome. Yeah, like I said in the video, I really enjoyed that conversation and getting to chat with Veronica and Tamika, who I found out earlier on I was saying her name or their name wrong the whole time. But that is what we do in this world, is figure out that we might be saying something wrong and learn from it and move on. Veronica, I have a quick question for you because I'm not seeing any in the chat per se. I'm wondering, you have a wonderful new book that I have read, and some people in the chat have also read. What has been sort of some surprising reactions to it so far, that whether they're positive or negative, that you would feel comfortable sharing?
Overall, the feedback has been positive. There was a very right-wing group here in Texas that had negative feedbacks, but it is what it is. But overall, it has been positive, and I think that some people wish I had gone a little bit further and answered some questions for them. But I was very intentional in not providing answers for the fact that every community is so different, every context is so different. And so really trying to just provide frameworks that people can then customize to their particular community. And so I try not to be so prescriptive about it. And, but so far, all the feedback has been very positive.
Wonderful. We do have a question from Lindsay in the chat, who identifies as a white male engineer, if I'm getting that correctly, feeling a bit lonely in this space and wondering how to build safe and brave community conversations with people that identify similarly or who are disadvantaged by the existing transport systems and have a better chance to make it work.
I would say for all of us in this transportation world, it is, we're often outnumbered in many cases. And so part of it is being very intentional about building community in organizations that exist. There is Women's Transportation Seminar. There's the Conference of Minority Transportation Officials. There's all these other groups that are out there where they are bringing people together. So you have the space to just be. So I think that there are those places there. And I think at work, it is about, while we look to leadership, there's always things that we can do, even whether we're in middle management or new in our careers, because the reality is the lower, down the organization chart, the more people there are. So it is about bringing people together and doing our best to respectfully create places for people to learn. And a great example at my previous, job, I had a team that had a whole virtual travel series, and they did it during lunch. And it was really about, because of the diversity of staff got an opportunity to talk about the countries they were from, the language, the conflicts that may be there, and all of those things. So it is a way that doesn't have to always feel heavy. It doesn't always have to be a heavy conversation. But it was a way for people to be able to share about themselves and share the things that they're facing. So there's always ways to do these things that doesn't have to be, these big, heavy, deep conversations.
And another question that's come up that I think is definitely a challenging one that a lot of people are thinking about is the way that technology is moving so quickly now with autonomous vehicles and various other emerging technologies. And do you think that's going to create new opportunities in this space or more challenges? And that question comes from Elizabeth Lehman.
I'll say this. I think when you look at the tech companies and look at the lack of diversity at the tech companies, all you're really doing is taking these kind of analog biases and putting technology on it. You still haven't fixed the challenges. You still haven't addressed the concerns of certain, different groups. So I think technology could have a place, but I think to really get there, you need to make sure that others are at the table. And a great example, and I share this in the book, of initially with automated sinks, it had trouble detecting darker skin. Well, that's because no one ever thought about it. If you're only testing it on a certain type of skin color, then you have it working for one group. And I think that is the point of, even when Tamika talked about, centering Blackness and as part of what she's researching, it is about that. How do you center some of these groups and make the technology work for those groups, and then it works for the rest of us? And so I think that is the biggest challenge, what we have right now. We do know that autonomous vehicles have trouble detecting darker skin. We do know that autonomous vehicles, they're so focused on getting it to work that it doesn't understand, the technology doesn't understand the chaos of cities. And that is why we love cities. Cities are chaotic. Cities are loud. Cities have people doing things that are unexpected, and the technology can't adapt to that chaos. Which is why you saw companies that were trying to be fully autonomous quickly pull those vehicles out of cities. I know in Austin and San Francisco, because they weren't prepared for the chaos of the city. So that's my long-winded answer.
Not long-winded at all. Perfectly worded. We do have another question here. What recommendations do you have for transportation agencies seeking to reach individuals who are working during standard business hours? And the author here says, often attending a meeting about transportation is a low priority when there are other priorities in life.
Absolutely. So I'll say this, and I do share this in my book in chapters 4 and 5. You have to go where people are. If, no one wants to go to, even people who are passionate about a project, don't want to go to your stale elementary school, basement or luncheon to go listen to a meeting. People are trying to get dinner on the table. People are trying to get homework done with kids. One of the things that we've found, and I share this in the book, is doing things during those off-peak times and those off-peak hours, if you really want to reach people, and go to where they are. So I see someone just, oh, it's Christine Mayer. So she used to work for me. But to her point, it's grocery stores. Go to grocery stores on the first of the month. That is where you can be effective, because everyone has now received their benefits and they're attempting to get their groceries for their families. We did things in bus stops, whether it's the middle of the day or the weekend. And you literally get people coming off the bus stop into the meeting. And we have data, and Christine and I worked very long and hard about this, but we have a lot of data where we can show that even on the same block, we had a public meeting that was in a government building during the evening, and we had a public meeting that was right outside that same exact building. And demographically, you had two different groups. The people that showed up to the meeting inside were mostly white. The earlier part of the meeting, it was older white people, and the later part of the meeting, it was younger white people. We moved that same meeting on the same exact block outside. And when you look at the demographics, it was a much better representation of the full community, both income, race, and ethnicity. So I think that in order to do that, you really have to be very intentional about going to where people are, putting things in church bulletins, newsletters for different places of worship. That's a great way to reach people. Making sure that it's in their language and not just translated in their language, because translation, things don't often translate well. So making sure you have people that are culturally competent in the language you're translating to. And Spanish is an example. All Spanish isn't created equal, right? If someone is from Mexico or someone is from Spain, even that translation may not make sense in a cultural context. So it's all of those things.
I'm going to give one last question just in the interest of time. And I know that there was some examples of good bike buses or people working on bike buses in America that could be worth checking out. Also, Megan Ramey, who's in Hood River, is doing a lot of really great work there. If you know her, check her out. But I guess, Veronica, my question to you is, because a lot of times we see these are more focused on the presumed dominant culture, let's say. So how do we get these kinds of activities more inclusive to marginalized communities or historically overlooked communities to make sure that if we're implementing bike buses or walking school buses to get kids to and from school, how do we make that a much more inclusive practice to ensure that it's not just the same people with the most benefits to transport still benefiting?
Absolutely. So, similar to my last answer, it's going to those communities and understanding how they are moving, why they are moving. I'll give a really great example, Safe Routes to School, which in the United States, I don't know if it's nationwide or global or not, but Safe Routes to School, it's really focused on how kids are getting to school. One of the things that I learned working in a Black community was we were so focused on the kids getting to and from school that if you don't go out there and observe for yourself and literally sit there during school dismissal and arrival, you can miss that many of the kids were brought to school by an older sibling who then had to go to their school. So it wasn't just about a safe route to school. In this case, it was we need a safe route between schools so that a sibling can drop off their younger sibling at elementary school and then safely continue the rest of their trip to their middle school or high school. And so I think that as you're talking about working in communities, they've been historically disinvested because we haven't invested in them. And so part of it is going in with an open mindset, an open framework, but really taking the time to observe and not bring an assumption of a different community into this community. Truly like observe with your eyes, talk to people to figure out, what are the differences of this particular community.
Awesome. Yeah, great words, great advice. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you to everyone who's attended. As was mentioned in the video, you can reach out to Veronica and Tamika via various social media platforms, and we will include all of the relevant links in the show notes for you to check out. And aside from that, please do join us again in 2 weeks for our next session, where I've totally forgotten which session it is, so I'm going to pass it over to Emma, and Emma's going to take it over from here for me.
Thank you, Melissa, and also thank you, Veronica and Tamika, for this brilliant session. I think it was a great way to premiere our webinar series, and we just extend the invitation to also join our second episode. As mentioned, it will be in 2 weeks on the 7th of March, same time, 4:30 p.m. Central European time, and we'll be focusing on gender, mobility, and disability, and intersection of these experiences, and are joined by the expert Dr. Kay Inkel, who is a campaign and policy manager for Wheels for Wellbeing, an NGO that focuses on making biking more accessible to everyone, and then also by Anna Zieverts, who is showing us how we can accommodate people who are non-drivers due to income, due to health. And I think these are topics that we are really looking forward. So we will be sharing the link right now in the chat and looking forward to seeing you then next time.
With that, thanks everyone, and see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.